everybody. Good to see everybody. It's been quite a time, hasn't it? These last few months that we've all been living through and living in. And my profession and my career interests have sort of served well over the last 3 or 4, 5 months because, being an Agile coach, one of the things that we espouse is trying to stay flexible and adaptable and sort of go with whatever the current set of circumstances dictates. And so I've been trying to do that, and I'm guessing most of you have been trying to do that over the last 3 or 4 months. So really great to be here, and thank you for inviting me to be part of this. I miss getting together, miss seeing everybody, and I'm sure you do too, but this is a great alternative. And so I'm thankful to the council for, putting these on.
Great. Well, thank you, Gene. If anybody has questions, just pop them in the group chat and I'll ask Gene. So Gene, 2 questions. First, I think we probably need to have a little primer on what Agile is. And then why don't you tell us about you and what you're doing and how that all ties in together?
Sure. Sounds good. Yeah, so Agile is essentially a set of values and principles that guide complex project work. That's a bit of a mouthful, but Agile emerged out of the software engineering industry in the early 2000s because a group of software architects and highly skilled folks were very dissatisfied with software projects and the outcomes. They were very, very poor, expensive failures, generally. Not everyone, but generally. So folks got together and came up with what they call the Agile Manifesto. And the Agile Manifesto is a set of values and principles that they came away with saying, hey, we want to really embrace these values and principles. So for instance, the top value in the Agile Manifesto is we value individuals and interactions over process and tools, which is a pretty profound statement, honestly. It basically says, if we have a choice, we are going to invest and emphasize our people over the process. And prior to the manifesto in the last 15 to 20 years, it was sort of the reverse. And maybe you can relate to some of this. If we have our plan, if we have that all scoped out to a fine level of detail, and if we follow that plan to the, nth degree, we're going to succeed. And that was really the method in place. I'm oversimplifying, but that was the method for executing project work for many, many years. And then Agile sort of came on the scene and started to flip that on its head. And over the last 20 or so years has expanded well beyond software into almost every sphere of business and organization. And the next wave of Agile is really hitting in terms of organizational agility and business agility. So initially, the focus of Agile was how do we make our teams more effective and productive? And this, by the way, can also be done individually. So we could talk about that. But the focus has shifted a bit from how do we make our individual teams most productive to now how do we make and scale the entire organization to be effective and productive, which is a much larger challenge, as you can imagine. But agility, if you want to boil down the concept or notion of agility, think of these words: inspect and adapt. Inspect and adapt. And many of you may have heard those words. It's about doing something that's a priority, checking the work that you're doing along the way, reflecting on it. Did we hit the target? Did we add value? And then figuring out what didn't work so well and what could be done differently and what will we do differently to make things better, and just keeping that cycle going. So it becomes, as I've been doing this now for 15 or so years, it becomes ingrained. It's becomes, if you want it to be, more part of your life, honestly. And Bert knows this, and some of you may know this, but we use some of these Agile principles at home, and many families have decided to do some of this to be more productive, more collaborative at home. And so we could talk more about that. But that's a long answer to the question, the initial question of what is Agile? And I'm certainly open to any questions around that that you might have.
Right. Gene, how did you come to this, and how did you fall into Agile, and what have you been doing with it over the last few years?
Sure. So my career started a long time ago, and it was in software, but I worked as part of a human resources department that needed a software package. And I'm not going to take you through my whole career because I would bore you to tears, but I experienced the very thing that I just described. We had like lots of projects, lots of teams, lots of interaction that we thought was working, and then only to find out, hey, our plans were falling apart. Our ultimate deliveries were late. The clients, whether they were internal or external, were not happy. And I felt very dissatisfied. I was like part of this. And, nobody wants to spend all their time doing things that ultimately aren't successful, right? So I sort of innately felt that had to be a better way to do this kind of work. And I found myself working for a company called Kronos that you may have heard of, big time and attendance company. And they were going through an Agile transformation for these very reasons. They had been in business a while, they were successful, but they were getting caught up in this problem of complexity and how to make sure that what they were delivering was reflecting what their clients wanted at that point in time. And they were taking sort of longer and longer to do the work they needed to get done. And at the end of the cycle, they were delivering less and less. And they realized this has got to change. And they, at the time, did something very courageous, because it was back in the early 2000s. They jumped right into Agile. It was new, wasn't well understood by a lot of people, but the CTO at the time knew they had to do something differently. And so I became part of that. And I was embedded in that transformation. And what I found, and I've shared this before with folks, the reason I'm still working in this realm is that the values and the principles do work. And the way of the world is changing so much that, planning and plans are two different things. It's great to have a plan, but if you're not revisiting and replanning and sort of checking those plans against what you want to achieve, you can end up wasting a lot of time. So I have, over the last few years, I would say 5-6 years, been consulting with clients to help them become more agile so that things like we've experienced in the pandemic, I'm thinking of a couple of examples, and I'm sure you all have your own, but one of my clients local to Cape Cod is Convention Data Services. So, that whole business got thrown on its head almost immediately when the pandemic hit. Conventions were shut down, right? So what do they do? How do they react? My oldest son is a personal trainer for a very large gym in the Boston area. Shut down. What do they do? How do we do this virtually? How do we continue to make this business viable? And so they were having to, very quickly become agile in that sense. And then lastly, and then I'll turn it back over to Bert, the company I'm working with now is a very large insurance company, very traditional. I guess you'd call them old school. But, almost overnight, their entire workforce had to work from home. And we're talking about 4,000 to 5,000 employees that had never really worked from home before as a rule. And in fact, it was discouraged to some extent. But all of a sudden, they were having to figure out, well, how do we now make this work? And how do we embrace it so that we can continue to succeed? So again, a bit of a mouthful, but the notion of agility is more important today than it's ever been before.
Great. Thank you, Gene. So Brian has a question for you. He says, Gene, you seem dismissive on plans. Does Agile still require some traceability back to business? Are plans no longer a viable technique? And he says, in my humble opinion, plans and roadmaps need traceability to strategies so that when strategy changes, you can determine what projects and features need stopping or enhancing. So what do you think about that?
Yeah, superb question, Brian. I remember we had some really good dialogue at the workshop over this, and I appreciate your consistency along these lines.
Stubbornness, some people would say.
No, I think it's a really, really good question. Here's my perspective from an Agile standpoint. It's not, the planning is super important. In fact, the planning part is probably more important than it ever has been for the reasons that you suggest. Are we hitting our targets? The change or the difference would be in the plan and how frequently you're sort of planning and looking at it. So, it's planning is super important, critical. The plan, not as much in terms of long-term. Doesn't mean you don't. You absolutely have to plan. And it's just about how do you shorten the cycle in a way that's effective for you and your organization. I mean, it's very hard to plan every day, but what's the right sort of cadence and time frame that allows you to look at your plan and then examine it in light of the outcomes that you're looking for? So super good question. You still need to plan.
Yeah, no, I would also argue that the plan has to be traceable. So whatever you're building in your Agile world has to be traceable back up so that when things change, because they change all the time, that you have the mechanism by which you can very quickly adapt. Because that's where I've done lots of client work over the last 25 years, and that's where they struggle, is when they feel like they have to throw a plan out or throw a roadmap out because change happened. Well, assume change is going to happen. And what we tried to do is create living roadmaps so that you could adapt, you could change it, whether it's monthly or quarterly or annually. And we did it very successfully. Now, I don't know that we linked it as well as we could have into the development cycle, if you will, but at least we could bring it down to projects and investments. I think the feature would be the interesting way to connect it.
Yeah. Excellent. The only other thing I would add is some organizations have used agility as an excuse to shift gears so fast that you don't understand where you're going anymore. So I think you raise a really good point. There still needs to be a strategy. There need to be targets, goals, and objectives. And then, how do you align what you're doing with those goals and objectives in a meaningful way? So
you're speaking my religion now. That's
yeah.
business architecture.
I knew we weren't so far off, Brian.
No.
That's great. So, Gene, we've all experienced, a massive shift in how we've been working over the last 4 months. What have you seen, and maybe what insights do you have for all of us, as teams and maybe as individual contractors, whatever? Now that so many of us are working remotely?
Yeah, another really good question. I think Elaine started to capture some of this up front, which is I have personally seen the evolution of our new world in terms of our work arrangements and our personal interactions with each other. So initially, for people and for companies who had not been well versed in things like Microsoft Teams and Zoom and Skype and all those, FaceTime and all those things, it was really tough. So what Bert has pulled together so well today and what everybody is taking advantage of so nicely in terms of, our interaction, our ability to communicate was really not so advanced in the first phase of this. And it made for some difficult times. So, audio problems, were rampant, video problems even worse, and people not really knowing what the expectations were around the engagement. So for instance, as Bert suggested up front, I'm sitting in my kitchen with a background, which is just my porch behind me. And is it okay if my cat runs across my shoulder? Or what do I do when, my son needs something and I'm in the middle of a call, right? And, how do we handle these things? And there wasn't an understanding, right? So it was kind of evolving in real time. And I think the piece of advice that I got from folks that have been doing this longer remotely, you got to allow for those things. It has to be okay. You sort of have to be in the non-judgment zone, because if you don't make it okay, then people disengage, because life is more important than a video call. And so if things are happening here at home, I have to attend to those things. So what I've seen personally, and I think it's sort of broad-based, is an evolution in our maturity of how to connect virtually and how to be productive. And, where's that balance between home and work, and how do I draw the line? It continues to evolve, but we've matured, I think, collectively over the last 3 to 4 months.
Do you have any tips for people who are working from home to, maybe adapt some Agile principles into what they're doing, and maybe even bring some of those principles to the teams that they're working with remotely?
Yeah, another great question. I think one of the things that Agile, one of the important parts of Agile in terms of the manifesto is valuing face-to-face communication. And so there are a lot of things that when we don't have face-to-face communication that we lose. Nonverbal cues, just the subtleties of our appearance, and lots of things that if we're just on the phone in particular, we're not seeing each other, we don't have the benefit of. So one of the things that I've encouraged and will continue is to try to have the video calls, right? Even if, they're not perfect and they have all the flaws that we talked about in terms of interruptions and things happening, as much as you can encourage the face-to-face communication via remote, that's much, much more effective. In fact, I'm working with someone now who is in leadership, and they're really superb leaders, but you get a totally different feel if they're not on video. It's just, you lose something, you lose the personal sort of touch. But when they're on video, you're seeing sort of a lifeblood from the person, the smiles, just the way that they are. You're just getting more of that than if you're not. And it does that person a lot of good. So I think that's a big, trying to replicate the face-to-face communication where you can, is one tip. And then I think the other is,
Gene,
yeah,
can I make an observation though?
Sure.
I don't know, maybe this is a gendered thing, but I am missing though the quick phone call. Like, in my job, I was remote. I run a campus of a university. I used to just have normal quick phone calls with people. My boss, he's walking to a meeting, and now it's like, I don't know. It seems like a lot of pressure that that things that used to just be a phone call are now a video call, and it just is like this other labor that. Sometimes I'm like, oh, like I, have on a crappy outfit, and then I have to like put on my thing and make sure my background, so I don't know. Like I would say like my bosses tends to just hop on the phone with me still. And I'm so appreciative of that, because it seems like every other interaction that I have now ends up being a video meeting, and it feels like a labor to me that I didn't used to have in my day-to-day job. So I'll just put the plug in, like a quick phone call sometimes is like still okay. Like we can still talk on the phone.
Yeah, absolutely agree. 100%.
Yeah.
The other element to add on to that, Jen, is, to use things like chat. So many of you probably have access to chat software where you can just open up a chat window and say, to your point, Jen, I don't need a video call, but I'd like to get 2 minutes of your time,
Right.
or, have an ongoing sort of dialogue. So the phone is still important, definitely. Things like chat, I think, have a purpose because it is a bit draining, isn't it? A video call, if you're on video all day, you get to the end of the day and you're just tired, and that's a little different than being face to face in an office or, some other environment.
It's also hard to multitask. If you look at the 7 rules, they say not to hide behind the picture, which I used to do quite a bit.
That's really interesting. I was on a call, just very quickly, where this is at the beginning when the pandemic sort of just started, and this was Agile Alliance put this call on, and there were 6,500 people. I don't know if anybody took advantage of this. 6,500 people logged on to a Zoom call, and one of the folks said the biggest barrier that people have to being on video is the multitasking. Because we like to do different things, and we do have different things going on. So, I don't have any ready answer to this one. How do you manage that for yourself? Because we all still have those needs, and we still all have to do other things sometimes. And it'd be interesting to hear what maybe some folks think about that one.
I think it was perfectly normal. Like, we have a lot of big meetings in my workplace, like 120 people, 200 people. When we were in person, people were sitting at their tables, tapping on their laptops, doing other things, checking their phones. So the human, I think we can only really pay attention for a short amount of time. I don't know if it's like 8 minutes or 20 minutes. I know it's very short. So I'm for, like, I've done, webinars where I've cooked dinner and listened and really got a ton out of it, but my hands were going, doing something I was enjoying. And it was like a better experience than if I had just sat there and sort of forced myself to stare at the person talking. So
yeah, that's
I'm
excellent.
off with a multitask, if it's appropriate, if it's not a meeting that you're supposed to be chatting.
Right. Good.
There are a lot of big meetings that are really inefficient because, like, a lot of times you're like waiting 10 minutes for everybody to show up. It's like, can we get the meeting started for those of us who are on time?
Good point. Do you find, Mark, that those are getting better or worse in this new world that we're living in?
It depends on the person running the meeting. Some people will never change, but you really need to have like a tight agenda, and don't let the meeting go on for an hour and a half. But do the coffee talk at the end, not the beginning.
Interesting. Good.
Yeah, when Gene and I were talking about this yesterday, Gene, I think you referenced a 45-minute call you were supposed to be on that ended up being 90 minutes.
Yeah.
And, I think there's some etiquette around that as a meeting organizer. If you say it's going to be 45 minutes, it's really up to you to keep it to that 45-minute time frame, because people plan for that. And
yeah, and I think we were talking, Bert, I wanted, like, some of the information that was sort of dripping out after 45 minutes, I would have liked to have gotten. But the fact of the matter is, I didn't plan for 90 minutes, and I didn't have that amount of time. So the good facilitation and the agendas and things are more important, I think, now than they ever have been.
So I want to go back home again, and I'm really curious about how you manage your household with Agile. What are the things that you do? Like, specifically, what are some of the ways that you use Agile to impact the running of your household?
Absolutely. So, see if anybody else is this sort of over the top. But what I do is a weekly planning cycle, and I involve my wife, who is certainly fundamental to that, and anybody else that might be part of the plan for the week. But what I do is, like, Saturday, Sunday of the week coming, I'll look ahead and say, oh, first thing I ask myself, what do I want to accomplish in the coming week? And that alone can be challenging. Think about all the things that you'd like to accomplish. And I force myself to narrow that list to just a couple, 3 things that if I get to these and if I complete them, I will have succeeded. that week. So I come up with like a theme. And then, so for instance, this week past, I had 2 important things that I really wanted to be sure I accomplished well. I am the president of our local homeowners association, and we had our annual meeting this week. And with the pandemic and social distancing and how do we make that work? So that was like one big to-do item. And then the other was trying to prepare for, our call today and how I could be productive and effective there. So I had a couple of objectives. And then what I do is I slice those larger objectives down into the smaller pieces. And I create a task list of sorts. And I don't go down to the nth detail because it's too much. I don't need every 15-minute piece of work. But so for instance, I got to send out emails. I got to, print out letters. I have to have the financial report ready. I need to set up the outside, those things. And I put them, honestly, and you could do this more advanced than I do, I put them in a spreadsheet because that's what I'm used to. Some people use Post-it boards. They physically take Post-it notes and just put them in, like, here are things I want to do, here are things that are in progress, and here are things that are done. And they manage their week that way. So I go about that, planning, doing, and then when I also, of course, things change during the week. So I'm every day in the morning, I'm looking at, all right, so where am I at? So here are the things that I said I was going to do this week. Here are the things I said I would do today. Do I need to revise those things? Sort of that, like Brian and we were talking about, look at the plan. Is it still working? Do I need to make any revisions? The neat part, so I go through the week and get a lot done. If you do this sort of thing, and I'm guessing some of you probably do, you find you get a lot done, which is gratifying. But at the end of every week, I'll get together and talk to my wife and other people and say, well, how did we do? So how did the week go? What didn't go the way we wanted it to? And what do we want to do differently next week? So for instance, I signed up for 3 meetings and they all went long. Well, I can't do it that way next week because I won't accomplish what I was trying to do. And so I'm only going to take 2 of those meetings because I know they might run a little long and I don't have time for the third. So anyway, it's a weekly planning cycle and then a reflection on how did we do and what do we want to do differently? And then you start the whole thing all over again. And what's neat about it, if you're open to it, is just like in the workplace, you develop kind of a rhythm and a cadence. It doesn't feel like work at all. It's just sort of part and parcel of the way you are and live. And then when major things hit your radar, they're not as overwhelming. So I think I've shared this before. It'll be 5 years that we're here in the Cape in October, which is, we love it here. So glad that we made the move here. But the move itself was like a daunting project. In the midst of working and life and everything else, we had to move. And without this sort of agile approach, I don't think I couldn't have handled it. Maybe others could have. But so anyway, not sure how helpful that is. That's how we do it at our house.
And do you have buy-in from your wife and others?
I'll call it varying degrees. So overall, yes, 100% buy-in conceptually into all of what I just said. I don't have anybody participating with me to the degree that I get into it. It's too much, right? It's like they don't need to know that. So for instance, the homeowners meeting, and my wife Nancy's on the board of the homeowners thing too, but they don't need to know the 5 things, and she doesn't need to know the 5 things I need to do to accomplish one of the objectives. So she's not as engaged, but she is generally pretty engaged. And we've learned how to make that work. So, I've heard now, I wish I knew about this earlier. My kids are older. You can manage your family and get them very engaged in what's going on at the family with things like this. So if you have children, sort of asking them, or telling them, here are the things we're trying to do next week. What are the kind of things that you can do to help? right? Sort of giving them tasks and letting them see the progress, involving them. So it can be, I think it can be a lot of fun and productive at the same time.
Well, I think that sounds great. I just want to open up the floor. Does anybody have any questions for Gene?
Yeah, Mark, you had raised your hand, I think.
Yeah, I have a friend who does like planning poker and Six Sigma with their kids, but they don't tell them that the kale is good for them.
That's perfect. Absolutely perfect. Planning poker is a cool concept that helps you estimate the kind of work that you're about to do. And so you basically give people cards with numbers that represent like a relative value. Some of you may know this. Like 1, 3, 5, 8, 13. You say, okay, how long is this going to take? And everybody turns the cards over. And some might say 1 and some might say 13. Then you have some conversation about that. Well, we're not on the same page here. Why do you think this is a 13? You know, why do you think it's a 1? And usually a lot of good information comes from that. So that's cool, but you don't call it that, right? So people don't think it's overly geeky.
Yeah, she posts pictures of it just to show how she tricked her kids into doing it.
That's great. Love it.
Anybody else? Gene, do you have any final thoughts for us?
Oh, wait, I'm sorry. It takes me forever to unmute.
I hear you.
What do you recommend for us to learn more about Agile? I know there's some books out. I can't believe it's been 2 years since you did your Friday meeting. Any recommendations?
Yeah, for people who are interested in learning more about Agile, to me, the best centralized source of information is LinkedIn. There are about a dozen LinkedIn groups. If you just go on LinkedIn and search for Agile, you'll see them. And if you begin to follow some of the, better participated in groups on LinkedIn, there's tremendous information there. And just good exchanges. So people will ask questions about the realities of Agile, either in the workplace or sometimes at home. And you can either participate in those discussions or just sort of lurk and, receive the information. But that's a great starting point. I'm trying to think of other avenues. Books are great, and Agile Alliance is a great organization to do a little research on as well. So they put out podcasts, they have webinars, they have conferences, and they're doing things virtually. So I would recommend Agile Alliance. I have no affiliation with them other than, a member in their organization, but really, really good. So those are a couple things that come to mind.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Gene?
Yes, hi,
Eldon Ziegler. Hey. I come out of the software world, so I see it, from that point of view of where, the examples of how things can go bad are legion. I think particularly, if I remember right, the FBI system that was scrapped was several $100 million.
Yes.
And it just seems to me that the trade-off is, you have to have a plan, but you can't get so locked into it that, you lose the ability, as you said, to adapt as things change on you. When I do software design, I just assume I'm going to throw out what I did and start over. My experience is you just have to plan on that, and that kind of thing can carry over, I think, beyond software too, that, you do your best to anticipate what's coming, plan for it, but then you have to get the job done.
Right.
And it has to be the right job, right? So, it's kind of in line with, in places you need a strategic plan to give you a framework. But then to me, then you have to be able to work within that to say, first of all, is the plan still right? But more short term, how do you get it done? And that requires some focus. Right? Early in software, you have to be able to focus. Otherwise, you're going to have screw ups all over the place. So the whole thing is very, very trade-offy,
Yes.
And it's really, to me, it's hard to know where that balance is at any one point. But you plow forward. At least that's my observation on it.
I think you're spot on, Eldon. And it's interesting because it's a bit of a continuum. And this is one of the challenges with Agile. So if you were to read the manifesto and you look at things where they say individuals and interactions over process and tools, you don't throw out your process and tools at all. But where's the line? Where's the, to what extent do you sort of shift in one direction versus the other? And it's an exploration. And, we all sort of arrive at where we believe the right answer is. And, but the fact of the matter is, the world is changing fast and we need to try and keep up. And that's where Agile can be very, very useful. So.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Well, any other questions for Gene? Well then, Gene, thank you so much for this. Always love hearing from you and appreciate your knowledge and your spirit around all of this. So thanks so much for being here with us today.
Oh, you're welcome.
Thank
so
you
good to see everyone. Thanks for having me. Appreciate
Great to
it.
see everyone.
I just wanted to give you a heads up of what's coming up next week. Kate McMahon, who's on our call here today, is going to be our guest for the coffee chat next week. Very much looking forward to that. Maybe chat about the Media Center and who knows what else. And on July 31st, we've got Bob Egan, who was our first Friday speaker talking about 5G back in December, which now seems like 5 years ago. And Bob Egan is going to be talking about some of the advancements and changes in remote work. So really looking forward to that. And then on August 7th, I believe it's August 7th, our first Friday, we've got Jim and Steve Tenaglia from Tenaglia Gardner Wealth Management. And they're going to be talking about what the economic recovery might look like from COVID and how it might be similar and different to the recovery that we had after the 2008 downturn. So should be some good financial information on that. And more to come. So thank you all so much for being here today. Very much appreciate your time sharing with us here at the Cape Cod Technology Council, and appreciate your good ideas and your input, and look forward to seeing you next time. So take care.
Thank you, Bert.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.